Hey guys, Kelly Vivo Cosplay here. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to show you guys how to make and sew on your own bias tape. That way you can create nice clean edges on your costume just like this. So let's get right into the video.
Alright guys, so the first thing you're going to want to get is some of these bias tape makers. I'll include a link down below to them. A rotary cutter, then you're going to need the fabric you're going to use. For this I'm using silk dupioni, and a quilting ruler. These are super handy, so make sure you have one. The first thing you're going to do is we're going to cut the fabric on the bias. The bias is a 45-degree angle on the fabric. The easiest way to determine this is by folding the fabric so that the grain lines are perpendicular. By taking the bottom right corner and folding it out towards the top left, you get that perpendicular 90-degree angle of the edges and the 45 degrees that we need to cut on. The 45-degree angle is going to be the stretchiest part of the fabric, hence cutting on the bias and bias tape. Now I'm cutting my bias tape 2 inches wide. This is why quilting rulers are extremely handy to have. As you can see, I can easily measure and cut in one swift swoop, I guess you could say. You're going to want to cut as many pieces as you're going to need. I didn't know exactly how much I was going to need, so I went ahead and cut multiple pieces of this scrap. We're going to sew it all together in the end to create one continuous piece of bias tape. Seriously, quilting rulers, they're amazingly handy. I use mine all the time. If you don't have one, get one. And the great thing about bias tape is we'll sew it all together so you can make it out of scraps if that's what you have left of the fabric for your project. So now that we have all of our pieces cut out, we're going to have to pin them together so we can sew them into one continuous piece. And we're going to do that by matching our edges up. So I stacked all my fabric nice and even. You can see my edge is also on an angle, and we're going to need to line these up. And you don't want to line the corners up. You're going to have some overlap of the corners, as you can see here. So that way when we stitch, we're going to stitch from edge to edge, leaving that bit of selvage in there. Essentially, you want that overlap so that everything is going to be perfectly straight. If you just lined up the very tip of the fabric to the edge of the other piece, you wouldn't have a perfectly straight piece of fabric. So we have to make sure that we overlap everything so that it is straight when we're finished. And you'll see that in the next step. And as you can see, sometimes I've taken my ruler and just adjusted or made adjustments to either the angle, or if I cut a little wide, I went and fixed that. And remember, if you guys have any questions about this, leave comments down below and I'll do my best to answer them. I know it's kind of hard to explain how to pin it together so that it overlaps, but hopefully visually you guys can see what I'm doing here. Now that we've done that and pinned all the pieces together, we're going to go ahead over to the sewing machine and stitch all these individual pieces together to create one continuous piece of fabric to create our bias tape out of. Now, I will say, when you guys pin everything together, make sure that when you pin it, it all goes the same way, because you don't want to accidentally stitch something backwards. I know, even the best of us have done that, but just a reminder. Once that's done, you're going to take your fabric over to your ironing board, and we're going to press open all the seams with our iron. Here you can see the little triangles that are overlapped, and we're going to go ahead and get rid of those with the rotary cutter. Now it's time to use the bias tape maker. I'm using the blue one, which will create the 1/2 inch bias tape I'm going for. So we're going to be making double fold bias tape. but you can use this to make single fold as well. Double fold is just going to be an extra step that I show you. So we're going to feed the bias tape in. We're going to take the corner and slide it in and literally just pull it through the maker, making sure everything is nice and straight. And it's going to fold it for us. Look how nice and easy that is. Now once you've got it started, we're going to take the iron, and it's super easy because we can grab this end of the bias tape and pull it, and everything folds. And you can pull and run the iron along, which makes your life super, super easy. After we pulled that through the bias tape maker, we have made a single fold bias tape. Now we're going to turn it into a double fold. And we do this by folding the bias tape over and pressing it a second time. You can use a single fold for some uses. I've used it decoratively on costumes, but we're going to want to have a double fold for finishing the edges of this costume. And there is our completed bias tape. Now it's time to sew it onto the costume. So first thing I'm going to do is we're going to pin the bias tape to the edge. So I'm going to open it back up, and I'm going to open it all the way so I can fold the edge inwards. This way I'll have a nice clean edge at the end where the zipper is. And we're going to go ahead and pin this all down. We're going to pin unfolded all the way around the edge of the fabric here, which is the neckline of this costume I'm working on. And you'll see why in a moment. Once everything's been pinned, we're going to stitch right along the fold line here from the iron when we pressed the bias tape. Now we're going to take the tape and we're going to fold it back over and over the edge of the unfinished edge of the fabric and pin it all into place. This will create that nice, clean, finished edge that we're looking for. Now that it's all into place, it's time for some hand sewing. The stitch that I'm using for this is called a ladder stitch. It's an invisible stitch that you can do via hand sewing so that there will be no stitch lines on the outside of the fabric. Essentially, it's like creating a ladder when you're stitching. So you'll run the stitch through a little bit, then you'll switch. So I sew through the lining, then I'll go to the very edge of the bias tape and run a stitch through, then I'll go back from the end of that into the lining. I'm going to make a video specifically to show you guys how to do a ladder stitch, but it's a very, very, very useful stitch to have in your arsenal to create very clean finished garments with no seam lines on the outside. I will add that you don't have to hand stitch your bias tape. You can go ahead and top stitch this using your machine if you want to, say if you're shorter on time or if you don't mind having stitches on the outside of the garment. I wanted a very clean finished look, and I often do this for my bias tape, so I'll hand stitch everything. Now when I do a ladder stitch, I will go ahead and check the outside just to make sure I didn't accidentally stitch through the outside of the fabric, because I have. It happens. So just make sure you're checking when you're sewing especially if you're working with thinner fabrics. With this, I've only got a layer of thin lining and a layer of dupioni, so it's very easy to sometimes catch that outer layer of dupioni and not just the lining. Now we'll stitch all the way around that neckline, and here we are finishing up at the end. And I'll go ahead and create some knots with the thread, and then once I've created the knots, I'll go ahead and run the thread back through where I had stitched to hide it. And this is how finished bias tape will look on your costume.
Alright guys, and that's it. That's how you make your own bias tape and attach it to your costume. Remember, if you have any questions, please leave those in the comments down below and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more cosplay content. See you next time. Bye!